I've been working as a nurse in a hospital in the UK for a few years now. This hospital has an interesting history. It was originally built during World War II as a temporary facility. But, as is often the case, temporary turned into permanent, and over the years it was expanded and modernized. Still, you can feel its age in the creaking floors and the way the shadows stretch just a little too far down the hallways. One winter night, I was on a night shift. The air was freezing outside, and the halls of the hospital felt eerily quiet, almost too quiet. A patient had been admitted earlier that evening for an infection. She was cognitively fine, no dementia or anything like that. So when things took a turn in the early hours, it really caught me off guard. It must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning when I heard her scream. The sound echoed through the nearly empty ward, jolting both me and another nurse out of our seats. We rushed to her side room, hearts pounding. When we got there, she was shaking and pointing toward the end of her bed, her voice trembling as she kept repeating, "A man with a bag over his head." He was standing there watching me. We tried to calm her down, reassuring her that no one was in the room, but the atmosphere felt wrong. It's hard to explain, but the air was heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on us. Despite our best efforts to assure her that she was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After she finally settled down, we turned to leave the room. As we stepped into the hallway, we both froze. Just ahead, through the faintly lit corridor, we saw a shadowy figure pass through a set of double doors. These doors were always locked and required keys to open. We stared at each other, trying to rationalize what we had just seen. But the time it would have taken for someone to unlock the doors, pass through, and lock them again didn't add up. It was impossible. Yet, the figure was gone. We returned to our desk, shaken. That night lingered in my mind for a long time, but it wasn't my only strange experience in that hospital. Another time, I was working in an older section of the hospital that used to be private, but had been integrated into the NHS in 2020. The layout was unique, shaped like a T, with only side rooms instead of the typical bays. It was another quiet night shift, and I was sitting at the desk with a colleague, writing patient notes, when we heard it. A scream, shrill and blood-curdling, like something straight out of a horror movie. It pierced the stillness, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Within moments, 3 of the nurses on shift came rushing down the corridor toward us, their faces pale. They asked me to check the rooms. Maybe it's because I was the only male nurse on the ward, but I agreed. I went through each of the 26 rooms, one by one. Each room was the same, dimly lit, silent, and with patients sound asleep. Not a single person was awake. It didn't make sense. That scream couldn't have come from nowhere, yet there was no one to account for it. On another occasion, I was working on a different ward. A patient had recently passed away in one of the side rooms. After the necessary procedures were completed and the room was cleaned, a new patient was admitted there. Not long after, the call bell rang. The patient looked uneasy and told us they felt like someone or something was beneath the bed. We moved them to another room, and just like that, the unease was gone. It's moments like these that stick with you, when logic and explanation fall short. The hospital is full of these stories. One of the most famous ones involves a doctor who was called to a cardiac arrest. On his way to the patient, he passed a young girl in the hallway who asked him where the exit was. He quickly pointed her in the right direction and rushed to the scene. When he arrived, he realized the patient he was supposed to attend to was the same girl he had just seen. The story goes that security footage showed the doctor gesturing to someone who wasn't there. Apparently, the incident shook him so much that he left the hospital and never came back. Whether it's true or not, I'll leave that up to you. But stories like these add to the sense of unease that lingers in the air here. Another chilling experience happened during a power outage. It was a stormy night, and the hospital's backup generators had kicked in, leaving the halls bathed in an unnatural, dim glow. I was making my rounds when I noticed a light flickering in one of the empty rooms. It was strange because all the empty rooms were supposed to have their lights off. Cautiously, I approached the room. The flickering stopped just as I reached the doorway, and the room plunged into darkness. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The air felt colder than the rest of the hospital, and there was a faint smell of something metallic, like blood. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, finding nothing out of place. But just as I turned to leave, I felt a hand, cold and firm, brush against my arm. I spun around, but there was no one there. I hurried back to the desk, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. Later that night, a colleague mentioned seeing a figure standing in the same hallway, staring at the door to the room I had just been in. She said it disappeared when she blinked. Over the years, I've come to accept that some things just can't be explained. This hospital, with its long history and countless lives passing through its walls, seems to hold on to memories, both of the living and the dead. And on those long, quiet nights, when the corridors stretch out into the dark and the silence feels too heavy, I sometimes wonder what's watching from the shadows. The hospital where I work has always carried a certain air of unease. For the past year and a half, I've been a service assistant there, working various shifts. Day shifts are busy with dozens of staff, but during the night shift, it's just 2 of us. That's when the hospital transforms and the stories come alive. It's no secret that some parts of the hospital have a reputation for being haunted, especially departments 12-3 and 28-1. My very first encounter happened in 12-3. It was my 3rd shift, and I was still training under Morton, an experienced service assistant. That evening, Morton told me to handle 12-3 on my own. Before I left, he gave me a stern warning. If you hear or see anything into 3, know you didn't. And if you hear your name, leave quietly and don't look back. I tried to brush off his words, but they stuck with me as I started cleaning the empty rooms. Halfway through, I heard a faint knocking sound. My heart raced, but I ignored it and kept working. Then, I distinctly heard Morton's voice calling me from another department. Remembering his warning, I left immediately, quietly pushing my cart to make it seem like everything was normal. When I reached the elevator, I paged him to ask if he had called me. He hadn't. His voice on the other end of the line was grave, but he was relieved I hadn't responded. From that night on, I avoided 12-3 whenever possible. But 12-3 wasn't the only place where strange things happened. That same evening, I had to clean 12-4, the department across from 12-3. This area has a surveillance system that staff are required to check during evening shifts. While reviewing the footage, I saw someone walking through the waiting room on the screen. I grabbed my phone to record it, but the figure disappeared before I could get a clear shot. When I replayed the footage, it was blurry, and the figure was gone. Sitting alone in that closed apartment, I felt a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Another memorable encounter happened in 28-1, a department locked after 3 p.m. Unlike other areas, 28-1 requires both a keycard and a code to enter, yet the doors often open on their own. That evening, I was cleaning while listening to music through my headphones. The eerie atmosphere of the dark, silent hallways was unsettling enough, but room 11 stood out. No matter how often it's cleaned, it always looks as though someone's trashed it. Papers and debris are scattered everywhere, and there's a suffocating sense of being watched. While I was there, I heard faint footsteps and the sound of something heavy being dragged down the hall. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sounds grew louder. My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I quickly finished up and exited the department. As I walked back to the service office, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The elevator near 28-1 has its own peculiarities. One night, as I took the elevator down to the ground floor, the doors unexpectedly opened into 28-1. From the darkness inside, I heard a voice say, "Come right in." Panicking, I pressed the button to close the door, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't until the door to 28-1 shut completely that the elevator resumed its normal function. That was the last time I used that elevator during a night shift. One of the most chilling experiences occurred during an overnight shift when I had to clean a small storage room adjacent to 28-1. The room was rarely used, and it was cluttered with old equipment and supplies. As I entered, I noticed an old wheelchair in the corner. Its wheels were caked with dust, as if it hadn't been moved in years. I turned away to start cleaning, but when I looked back, the wheelchair was in the center of the room. I hadn't heard a sound, but there it was, facing me directly. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and I felt a heavy pressure around me, like I was being suffocated. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision, and I could have sworn I saw a figure standing just outside the doorway, watching me. Paralyzed with fear, I forced myself to leave the room without looking back. When I returned later with a colleague, the wheelchair was gone. Neither of us could explain it, but we both agreed to avoid that storage room in the future. There's something about the hospital at night that amplifies every creak, shadow, and whisper. Whether it's the residual energy of past patients or something more sinister, I can't say. But one thing is certain. These experiences have left an indelible mark on me. To this day, I tread carefully during my shifts, always mindful of the unseen presence that seems to linger in the halls. When I was around 3 or 4 years old, I had a pretty bad fall down the staircase in my family's old Victorian house in Massachusetts. The house itself was always a little creepy, with creaky floorboards and dim lighting, but as a kid, I didn't pay much attention to that. The staircase I fell down wasn't just a straight shot. It was one of those old-style ones that turned midway before continuing downwards. As I tumbled, I hit the wall at the turn and busted my lip pretty bad. My parents, understandably worried that I might have hit my head, decided to take me to the Children's Hospital in Springfield, even though I cried and protested the entire ride. The thought of seeing a doctor terrified me. I remember clinging to the idea that I might need stitches, which, in my young mind, was the worst thing imaginable. My parents reassured me it would be fine, but I couldn't stop crying the entire way there. The hospital itself was a mixed bag. The regular children's unit had this amazing playroom filled with toys and bright colors, but unfortunately, we were sent to the children's ER, which felt cold and uninviting. The only thing to play with there was one of those bead maze toys where you slide the beads along loops of squiggly wires. It wasn't much, but it distracted me for a bit. I sat down and started moving the beads around the maze. That's when I noticed a boy sitting across from me on the other side of the toy. He was about my age, maybe a little older, and he seemed curious about what I was doing. I remember feeling a little startled at first. There was something unsettling about him, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it right away. As we played, I looked up at him properly for the first time and froze. The side of his head was cracked wide open. I mean, it wasn't just a cut or a bruise. It was like his skull had been split, and I could see something dark inside the wound. I didn't know what gore was back then, but it was the first time I'd seen anything like that. What struck me even more was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, a sickly sweet scent that made my stomach churn. I didn't know what it was at the time, but it lingered in the air, just noticeable enough to unsettle me. Still, I was a shy and anxious kid, so I tried not to let my uneasiness show. I smiled at him and kept playing, hoping he wouldn't notice how uncomfortable I was. We started chatting, and he asked me what had happened to my lip. I told him I had fallen down the stairs, and then I asked him what had happened to his head. He simply said he fell. Despite his injury, he seemed calm, too calm actually. We played together for a while, and I started to feel more at ease. At that age, I assumed he was just another kid like me, maybe even someone I knew from preschool. It wasn't until much later that I realized how strange the whole situation was. After a while, the nurse called me in, and my parents took me to see the doctor. They gave me some medicine for my lip and checked my head to make sure I hadn't hit it during the fall. I didn't see the boy again, and soon we went home. For weeks, I didn't think much about it. Then, about a month later, we had a fire drill at school. While we were lined up in the parking lot, I saw a boy who looked just like the one from the ER. My heart raced as I stared at him, expecting to see the same gruesome injury on his head. But his head was perfectly fine, no scar, no stitches, not even a sign that he'd ever been hurt. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't him, but the resemblance was too strong to ignore. It bothered me, but eventually I shrugged it off. I was just a kid, and my mind probably played tricks on me, right? Years passed, and I mostly forgot about the whole thing. Then when I was 20, the memory came back during a casual conversation with my parents. I told them about the boy in the ER, expecting them to remember. But they didn't. They remembered my fall, the trip to the hospital, and me playing with the bead toy. But there was no boy. My mom even said that if someone with a head injury like that had been there, he wouldn't have been in the waiting room just hanging out. That's when it hit me. The memory wasn't just strange, it was impossible. I thought back to the faint, sweet smell that had lingered around him. At first I assumed it might have been the smell of an infection. But then another memory surfaced. When I was a preteen living in Okinawa, Japan, I had smelled something similar, but much stronger. During a school trip, we walked through a rural area with farms. As we climbed a hill, the air grew thick with a terrible stench. At the top, we found a plastic bag hanging from a tree branch. Inside were the decaying remains of 3 cats. The smell was overwhelming, tangy, sweet, and rotten all at once. That was the same smell I'd noticed around the boy in the ER, only much fainter, like a shadow of the real thing. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that day. Was he a ghost, a vision, or just a trick of my young mind? All I know is that the memory has stayed with me, vivid and haunting, as if it happened just yesterday. And sometimes when I think back to that day, I wonder if he wasn't just playing with me but waiting for something I still don't understand.